Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to Geoffrey Miller, who is an evolutionary psychologist, as I understand it. Is it the University of Phoenix?
University of New Mexico in
University.
Albuquerque.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate you coming on. I noticed you first on Twitter when I noticed you were speaking out against the sort of I don't know, progressive hegemony of social media and, well, the political environment in general. What sort of inspired you to start actually putting your political opinions out there?
I think mostly I just got fed up with the sort of academic free speech issues and feeling like there are a lot of things I know as an evolutionary psychologist and a sex researcher and just kind of from life experience and from, reading fairly broadly that seem to be taboo where you can't really talk about them in American society or in a lot of British or European society. And so it really came out of a place of frustration that I thought valid viewpoints are being marginalized, to use SJW terms.
Okay, that's a great place to start, actually. So, excuse me. I take it that the best example of this is in James Damore.
Yeah, I think the whole Google fiasco this summer kind of further radicalized me. Because here's a very intelligent, slightly aspy young man who is speaking truth to power in a way. He's speaking scientific truth to a Google management that seems to have absorbed a lot of the social justice activist ideals and the progressivist ideals, and they're kind of imposing them in, they're imposing them on their employees and their managers in ways that sound subtle, but that are actually quite insidious and quite potent. And I had just written this article called The Neurodiversity Case for Free Speech that came out in Quillette.com and got a good response. And it was basically saying, look, there are a lot of people with various kinds of personality quirks and mild mental illnesses and who just aren't typical and who have strong opinions. And when they express those opinions, often they do that a bit bluntly or without showing the kind of expected degree of empathy that society sort of wants. And if you impose really strong speech codes and restrictions on, Aspies and other people who have personality quirks, it really is oppressive and silencing. And then almost immediately, we got James Damore doing exactly that and being treated as a pariah, getting fired by his company for saying things that are actually very solid scientifically. So yeah, that radicalized me, and I became a fairly vocal supporter of Damore and got in a little bit of trouble for it, but I don't care. I'm tenured.
Okay, well, that's great to hear, because then we can actually have the discussion properly, can't we? Okay, so let's talk about the science side of what Damore was saying. Now, I'm not a professor or a scientist of any sort, but it seems to me that just from my daily life and having lived within the world, that there are significant biological differences between men and women, not just physically, but also mentally. These are not discrete categories. There is a great deal of overlap, but there are general trends that put men in one section and women in another, and I think these manifest themselves in our daily lives, such as the choice of career, that men and women tend to choose one over the other in general, not entirely. And I think this has been demonstrated with such as the documentary The Norwegian Gender Paradox, where I don't know whether you're familiar, but Norwegian state was trying to do everything they could to get women to go into things like construction and technology, and it was very difficult for them. And in fact, this brings us to the problem that Damore was addressing, that Google was trying to improve the number of women working at Google, but finding it very difficult to do so. And of course, they had to resort to it being some form of discrimination against women while they were in the act of discriminating in favour of women. And they are apparently...
Or discriminating against men when they were sort of doing affirmative action for women.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they seem to be unable to really grasp that perhaps there is something else. And I think it's all based on the sort of social constructivist narrative, isn't it? That fundamentally there are no differences between men and women and everything is inculcated by society. What's your opinion on this?
Yeah, absolutely. As an evolutionary psychologist, I've faced for 25 years this sort of gender feminist view that, well, maybe evolution worked, but it only worked sort of up to the neck, and from the neck upwards,
Right.
the sexes are basically blank slates with regard to everything that is socially or economically, or sexually important. And I think that's just ludicrous and delusional because that's not the way it works in any other species. Sexual selection theory, which is what I use in a lot of my work, first developed by Darwin and updated and worked on and developed and empirically tested, is one of the most powerful theories we have in science. And it doesn't predict sex differences everywhere. It does predict sex differences any time that the two sexes faced different problems prehistorically, faced different selection pressures. Now, when it comes to certain things like, breathing or speaking or lots of kinds of thinking, cognition, memory, you don't expect big sex differences. You expect the sexes to be pretty similar in terms of being able to learn a language, being able to think about social problems. But sort of around the margins, you do expect pretty big sex differences in a lot of things where prehistoric males and females did different things and where the survival benefits and reproductive benefits were different for them. And I don't see how you can get around that. We know, there are chromosomal differences, genetic differences, hormonal differences, neurophysiological differences. And to believe that those don't matter in modern life is driven, it's a view that is honestly driven entirely by ideology. There's no good scientific theory that would predict zero sex differences.
I'm really glad you put it that way because I was about to interject that myself. It does entirely seem to be gender ideology that's driving this. And it seems that they have the goal in mind and they need to construct a path to reach that goal regardless of whether it reflects reality or not. They need to believe that men and women are exactly the same and will end up exactly the same, and the only way to account for the differential is through bigotry or prejudice. And I just don't think that's true.
So I grew up with a mother who was kind of a social justice activist, who was in League of Women Voters and advocated for women's, voting and the right to choose and all of that. But she was what Christina Hoff Sommers would call a classical liberal feminist. She wanted political equality. She didn't believe in the blank slate. She didn't want special treatment. She didn't want affirmative action. And that's how I grew up, and I still think that's a very reasonable view. Whenever you see true injustice that's based on legal discrimination, whenever you see social norms that are actually genuinely sexist or dismissive of women, we need to fix that and we need to work on that.
Sure.
And that's all totally valid. But when you have this view that you expect equality of outcome in every domain of work and life and leisure and sexuality, that's really harmful to both sexes because it kind of invalidates all of their quirks. Like it means women who actually do kind of want to stay at home and raise kids, or women who want to go into nursing because they really love taking care of people, can be made to feel kind of bad about themselves by the gender feminists for expressing what might be, pretty innate preferences about people over things. And conversely, the gender feminists try to make men feel terrible about all of our masculine, weird interests that women don't understand, where men tend to be more interested in them than women. Like, reading military history is just crazy masculinist oppressive stuff, whereas reading, the history of women's suffrage is completely wonderful and laudable. So I think those kind of double standards are really harmful to everybody.
I totally agree. I mean, I remember when I started looking into this, some of the first things I found were studies that were done on non-human primates, like chimps and bonobos, where they would essentially introduce an object into the environment, a doll or a toy truck or something like that, and they would find overwhelmingly that the male chimps would be interested in the mechanical object that they'd been given, whereas the female chimps would pick up the doll and care for it as if it was a baby. And this seems to be something consistent that's found within studies. And as a father of a young son myself, I can see this being replicated in his own behavior. He is fascinated with anything technological, anything mechanical. He has absolutely no interest in dolls or anything like that. And it's not that my wife hasn't tried to give him the option either. It's just that he just likes things. And I mean, why do they just outright dismiss these studies? Do they deny they exist? Do they have a counter argument to any of this? I mean, what do they say?
So I'm actually reviewing a Psychology of Women textbook at the moment, and it's very interesting how these studies are treated in the kind of materials that are presented in women's studies courses. So the tactic seems to be a combination of picking holes in the weakest possible empirical studies, right? So you don't take all of evolutionary psychology. You take like the 5% that is the flakiest and sounds the flakiest, and you critique that, and then you generalize that
Right.
as if it's representative of the field. You also question the ideological motivations of the researchers, which is basically ad hominem.
Yeah.
You point out kind of slightly embarrassing historical association. So you do guilt by association. You say, this is the same kind of thing that this or that person a century ago, wanted to research, and it's usually he had this or that racist, sexist view, and so therefore anybody who does the same kind of work or research or reaches the same conclusions must be the same kind of person. Those seem to be the three kind of tactics that are most common. And none of them, are really scientifically valid, but they are effective. They're effective rhetorically, and they do convince many young people that even mentioning biological sex differences will make you sound dumb and reactionary and will get you socially ostracized.
It's very interesting because, like you said, none of those are valid scientifically because none of those are a refutation of anything. They're all, as you say, attacks from other vectors. And this is something I find very interesting. Like I watched the way I was introduced to Jordan Peterson was he was having a debate on a program called The Agenda with Steve Paikin, and the person across from him began their argument, began anything with saying there is no such thing as biological sex. Now, if he'd said biological gender, I could kind of understand what he means, because gender is a social construct that, in my opinion, is informed by biological preferences and biological necessities. But to come out and say there's no such thing as biological sex seems that he's just denying the existence of chromosomes or something. I mean, and this seems to be a common thing.
Yeah, it's completely crazy because I honestly think that it's intellectual malpractice for people who teach gender feminism or women's studies not to know the basic biology, but many of them don't. They don't seem to understand that there are X and Y chromosomes. They don't understand that the biological definition of sex is based on the size of the gametes. Do you produce a big gamete called an egg or small gametes called sperm? There is no human that produces anything in between. You either produce eggs or sperm or neither. That's the definition of biological sex. It's really about the gametes. It's not even about the chromosomes, except insofar as they shape the gametes. And then, human bodies show dimorphism, differences between men and women in terms of height and strength and many aspects of physiology. And everybody in medicine knows you have to understand those in order to do things like diagnose and prescribe and do interventions. And then when it comes to issues like clinical psychology, right, dealing with mental illness, everybody in clinical psych is taught, these mental disorders have different base rates in the sexes, and the treatment needs to be a little bit different, and responses to medications need to be different. So in every domain, other than the ones that the gender feminists seem most obsessed with, we kind of have to deal with biological sex differences. Infertile couples, who go into a clinic have to learn a lot about gametes and sexual reproduction. And that typical couple ends up knowing more about biological sex, apparently, than the typical women's studies professor.
Honestly, at this point, I've been covering this for a long time, and at this point, I am unwilling to put it down to ignorance. I've seen far too much that is just outright and deliberate obfuscation, and in some cases, obvious lies, where I'm not prepared to give them good faith at this point. I think that, like you said, this is entirely ideological, and they're doing it on purpose. I genuinely think they are. I mean, like one thing that I see constantly is they will claim something like, well, look, there was a person, or there a tiny percentage of the population are born not with XY chromosomes or XX chromosomes, but XXY chromosomes, which just goes to show that there is no such thing as biological sex. This is somehow representative of a third gender or something like that. And I don't mean to sound callous, but what we're talking about is an aberration, isn't it? It's not.
Yeah, it's at least a statistical rarity, but it points to selection pressures. The fact that it's extremely rare to get anybody who's anything other than XX or XY means there were selection pressures against that.
Yeah.
Like evolution punished you for it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's rare. If evolution didn't care, then maybe a third or half of people would be, have different kind of chromosomal patterns for the sex chromosomes. But we don't see that. And I agree that the gender feminists are not operating in good faith, but I think there are two things going on. Number one, they're not totally ignorant about these things. It's just they compartmentalize, right? When they're at work, they say, it's all blank slate, it's all socially constructed, etc. But then when they go talk to their therapist or their friends about, the challenges of dating or their relationships, or talk informally about professional frustrations, of course they will stereotype just as much about the sexes as anybody else, right? It'll be like, my husband behaves this way, or my girlfriend behaves that way, or whatever it is. And so they compartmentalize. If they truly believed in the blank slate with regard to sex differences, and they took it seriously throughout all domains of life, they really couldn't function socially or sexually.
No, I agree.
Right? They wouldn't be able to deal with men or women appropriately. So the compartmentalization is one thing. I think they also avoid learning about certain, facts and theories and findings that sit uncomfortably with them. So they sort of wall that off, and they keep that at bay. And then, a lot of it is just driven by ideology and sort of policing other people's thoughts and speech, and policing their own thoughts and speech to some degree.
Well, that becomes a necessity, doesn't it? Because if there are scientifically valid studies and discoveries that have been shown to undermine your own comprehensive worldview, then you couldn't possibly allow those in. You would have to do something to. I mean, if you can't refute them, which I assume they can't, then you just on an ideological basis, you would have to ignore these things and completely distance yourself and outright deny that these things exist, wouldn't you?
It must be miserable to live in the state of cognitive dissonance that these people live in, and I kind of feel for them, because it's not happy having an ideology that clashes with reality in so many ways, so relentlessly. On the other hand, I don't really have that much empathy with them, because I really think they're having a terrible effect on society, a horrifying effect on men. I think they're interfering with scientific progress. I think their social policy recommendations are usually counterproductive, or just a complete waste of time. Yeah. And in 50 years, nobody's going to think like them. They know they're dinosaurs. They know that their views are doomed. And it's sad that they're so extreme because there are lots of things that women's studies scholarship has discovered that are really useful. For example, when I did my somewhat famous or infamous study on lap dancers 10 years ago, there wasn't very much written about sex work and lap dancing and gentlemen's clubs within mainstream psychology. So to do the scholarship, to learn about this domain of women's experience, I read a lot of the feminist scholarship about sex workers, where they'd done ethnographies, they'd interviewed these women, they learned a lot about them, and that scholarship was very, very useful to me. It was annoying because it was all framed in this sort of social constructivist way, but it would be a shame if all that good scholarship ended up, in the future just being dismissed just because the theoretical framework that the researchers used proves to be delusional.
Which I think it inevitably is going to be. I mean, like one of the things I find very interesting about I'm just going to broadly term it feminism, but I think you know what I mean. Is it's almost like the adversarial nature of it. It doesn't seem to be an inquiry into what's real. It seems to be an almost, I mean, Jordan Peterson calls them the activist disciplines, and I can completely see why he terms them that way, because they seem to want to reach a desired end goal rather than to honestly inquire into the subject. And this is like most, I think, exemplified in the desire for equal outcome in whatever field we're talking about. I mean, why? Just what difference does it make to them if it's not the same? And it's weird how they've become so emotionally invested, and this is the hill they've chosen to die on. It's one that's fundamentally against the very essence of what human beings are, and yet they're still persisting like this.
Yeah, it's like Napoleon or Hitler getting involved in a land war in Russia. It's
In
just the
Asia,
wrong. Yeah,
yeah.
land war in Asia. It's the wrong battle to fight. Um, because they'll lose. It's also the wrong battle to fight because I don't think the society they really want is actually defined by equal representation of people in different disciplines. I think the society that they really want fundamentally, I hope, is one in which men and women respect each other, understand each other, and get along better, and in which, neither sex oppresses or dismisses the other or undervalues their talents or their viewpoint. I think that's fundamentally what they want, that they want women to have opportunities and to be heard and to be valued and to have fulfilling lives. I'm not sure they really care about that for men, but, that's another discussion.
Yeah,
And then
oh, sorry.
yeah, and then I think they assume that the way to get to that point of women feeling valued and celebrated and appreciated and listened to and where women have an equal voice in political decision making and public culture. That's what I want too. That's what I think a lot of people want. For example, in my field, evolutionary psychology, we're about 50-50 male-female, both in terms of grad students and professors and other researchers, and it helps enormously to have both sexes actively participating and appreciated to just to do the science, just to understand how sexuality works and how mating and courtship and parenting works. It's super valuable. But I don't think you need 50-50 male-female programmers to get to that point.
I don't think they're ever going to get it, even if they think that they do need that. I just don't think it's going to happen. And I do think it's something to do with the nature of the job itself compared to the nature of the people who are interested in the job. This is something that I assume is fairly well established. That would you like to just tell people about the general preferences and how evolutionary pressures have contributed to that?
So, the big sex differences prehistorically would have been Males look for more short-term mating. They want more quantity of mates. They want to kind of spread their seed more. Women want more long-term investment and resources. So there's a bit of a clash in, how many sexual partners people want, how choosy they are, etc. And every mating system in every society that's ever lasted for more than one generation has somehow resolved that conflict, has made peace somehow. Now, sometimes it's males utterly oppressing women. Sometimes it's women have the bargaining power and convincing all men to do, long-term monogamous mating. So in the mating domain, those are differences. In the kind of work domain, you get the hunter versus the gatherer. Every tribal society we've studied, men do virtually all of the large game hunting, animals bigger than a cat.
Yep.
Men do most of the fishing. Men do all of the warfare, literally all of the warfare. There are no tribal societies ever found where groups of women band together and go, we're going to kill those women over there on the other side of the hill and steal their men and their land and their resources. It literally doesn't happen. So warfare is a big difference. Rates of fighting within the tribe, that's a lot more common among males. And then there's slightly more subtle things, like when you're hunting, the typical way you do it is you track game animals, you try to injure them with a spear or hand axe or whatever. You typically can't kill them, they run away, and then you chase them for a long time, and then eventually they drop, then you have to carry the carcass back to your home base. That requires a lot of dead reckoning and spatial navigation of a particular type where you need to be able to kind of calculate your angles and the animal went there and there and there. Now how do I get back home?
Yeah.
So men tend to be better at dead reckoning navigation.
And that's something that I've encountered before, is that men, studies have shown that men's spatial reasoning and various other sort of cognitive abilities tied to physical activities tend to be better. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So my PhD advisor, Roger Shepard, for example, developed tests of mental rotation where you give somebody a complicated shaped object and you ask, is this other version of it sort of rotated a certain amount, the same object, or is it mirror image flipped? And he found, you can track how good people are with this very precisely, and men are way better at it than women. Women are better at other things like spatial memory. Where is that thing? Where is that berry bush? Where are my car keys? So it's not like men are better at everything or that women are better at everything.
But just to stop you there, it's interesting how you felt the need to put that in, though, because it's instantly as if the question isn't just like on its own. It's as if it's automatically a competition. So it's not that men are better than it. It's strange that has to be addressed, isn't it? Because, I mean, at the end of the day, even if that was the case, men would still require women to produce children. So it's not like women would ever be a disposable item or a disposable facet of a man's life. And it's not like women aren't people. So, but it's strange that it has to be. You have to put that in there just in case or something.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's partly the social pressure from feminism to kind of reassure people I'm not a kind of traditional male sexist who thought just women are intellectually inferior in every domain. The way a lot of Victorian scientists really did think that, honestly. Like, Francis Galton, founder of intelligence testing, kind of had that view. So it's partly to dissociate myself historically from those guys. But it's also empirically important to remind people that the way evolution works is it doesn't make one sex better than the other. It makes each sex kind of equally good at doing the things that matter to that sex. The way I talk about it to my students is to say, look, average mutation load, the number of harmful mutations, is exactly equal in both sexes, just because of the way sexual recombination and reproduction works. The implication of that is women are as good at being women as men are at being men on average.
That's a great way of putting it, because that's something I was trying to drive to, really. The feminist dichotomy of it being a competition between the sexes is really, I guess, anachronistic when you go back to any pre-industrial society. Because if you look at just the struggle to exist before the amount of luxury we enjoy now, the idea of it being a competition and not a corporation is ludicrous. I mean, it was scarcity for everyone all the time, everywhere, unless you happen to be, I don't know, a king or part of the aristocracy or something. For most people, it was scarcity everywhere. So for most people, life was a cooperative endeavor rather than a competitive one. And it just amazes me that modern day feminists tend to view it in terms of class conflict, but I think we know why that is.
Yeah, I think what's going on there is that we have both a loss of close-knit clan-based interactions. People might live in group houses for a while during college, but then they go out on their own, and it's either living solo or maybe in a couple. So we've lost the kind of tribal structure of society that really puts an emphasis on long-term cooperation, conflict resolution, clear communication of what you want. In some workplaces, we're pretty good at that, and it kind of works in a little bit of a good tribal way. The other problem is delayed reproduction. In tribal life, prehistorically, pretty much all women would have been pregnant by about age 20, right? They would become sexually active by about 16. Their puberty would be a little bit later than it is now, maybe about 14, 15. And they'd start having sex and they'd start having babies by about age 20. And most of the young men would have kids by about 20, 25. And they typically have pair bonds and they do cooperative parenting. What that means is, prehistorically, men and women by young adulthood would already be responsible parents trying to deal with their co-parent, with the father and mother of their kids. And they'd have to resolve a lot of sexual conflicts between the sexes.
Sure.
Nowadays, if you delay reproduction until 30 or 35, or you never have kids, or you have kids but you don't live, if you're a woman and you never live with the father, you don't really have to resolve those conflicts, but you also don't understand the amazing capacity that each sex has to make peace with the other. So I think what happens with a lot of gender feminism is you have individuals who have no real experience, until their 30s often, of really having any serious long-term cooperation with the other sex that has any real stakes, like raising a kid. And I think that can lead to this adversarial attitude.
I've noticed as well, like some of the most prominent feminists seem to have emotionally unstable backgrounds. I mean, Gloria Steinem is the perfect example of this, where she's written many times, well, as a typical woman, and then if you just look into her background, she wasn't typical in any way, shape, or form. Her father was a travelling salesman who abandoned the family when she was 10 or something, and her mother had various mental disorders that prevented her from securing a proper job, and so she grew up in poverty with a mentally abnormal mother. And so, I mean, for her to then say, well, as a typical woman, it's like, well, I'm sorry, but you're clearly not, and you've clearly got emotional issues that have come from your childhood into your adulthood, and which obviously inform your activism. So it's very interesting how they're never interested in talking about themselves before they talk about what other people should do. It's something I find.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important here to well, 2 points. I think whoever our political or ideological enemies are, I think it's really important not to be kind of ad hominem or to sort of.
I wasn't trying to do that. I was just pointing out that
Yeah, it's this is a very tricky issue because we don't want to be ad hominem or even kind of sound ad hominem. The second issue, though, I think, which is kind of interesting, is, of course, the pioneers and the activists and the visionaries in any domain are going to be really weird people, right? They're going to be aspy or bipolar or just kind of freaky and weird, and they're going to have baggage and strange backgrounds, and they're going to be the kinds of people who are outspoken and get into trouble in lots of domains. And almost all the people I really admire are just ornery and unusual and kind of have some kind of mental disorder. Possibly the only exception I can think of is Charles Darwin himself, who's kind of pretty much a rock solid family guy.
Okay.
But beyond that, we have to be prepared to expect that anyone who's really passionate and a public figure and advocates anything unusual is going to have a lot of, heritable traits and family background that are honestly a little embarrassing. So like we're all a little vulnerable to that. The leading intellectuals in evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology are unusual people.
Right, okay.
And I think we just have to kind of make peace with that as a society. And that was one of the big themes of my neurodiversity article.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't trying to dismiss her claims on that basis.
Yeah.
I was just pointing out that maybe this is why they're drawn to that. But so okay, getting back to James Damore's memo then. Could you give a brief evaluation, as a person qualified to do so, on Damore's because the press, speaking generally of the left-wing press, has done their level best to misrepresent what Damore's intention was when writing the memo, and they misrepresent the fact that Google had asked for ways to get more people, more women specifically, into their company, and Damore had suggested not that women were actually incapable of doing these things, which was not his suggestion, but that Google was approaching things in a way that wasn't appealing to women on the basis that women have generally different interests to men. And I think that he was trying to restructure it. So could you give a quick evaluation of what you thought of Damore's memo from that perspective, please?
I was amazed that a Google employee who's not actually, a professional academic could get about 90% of the science exactly right. I've told colleagues if he did this as a term paper in an advanced graduate seminar in evolutionary psychology, it would get an A. It's accurate. In particular, he was very careful to distinguish between capability and preferences. He said, look, the sexes are actually very similar they're dead equal in general IQ. Right? If anything, maybe there's like a tiny difference, maybe, but in terms of raw IQ, the sexes are equal. And in terms of most cognitive abilities, like both sexes can acquire language very well. Both sexes can learn math. Both sexes can learn programming. He was not attributing the sex differences in outcome to capacity differences. He was attributing them to preference differences. He was saying women and men grow up just interested in different things, men on average more in things, women in people, and there are many other preferences that differ that explain like why the sexes tend to do, let's say, different leisure activities. And that was his pitch, and the press systematically and intentionally, I think, misrepresented that as, Damore is saying women are dumber than men. That's not at all what he said. So I think that was a shameful example of bad popular science and journalistic malpractice.
Totally agree. It was actually, I mean, I suppose in retrospect, I shouldn't have been surprised to see it, because I know what they're like, frankly, and I know what's driving them, but Damore had worded his memo so meticulously, and he had gone out of his way to stress that, look, I'm trying to help you achieve your goals. You're just you're not operating in the correct framework. That I was honestly taken aback when people were calling him names, and I thought it was completely unjustified. So, sorry.
Well, I think it's very important for the kind of gender feminist stranglehold on popular culture that you can't admit any biological sex differences. If you give an inch, science will take a mile. So I think they had to, once it went viral, once it became a topic of discussion, it was extremely important for the kind of leftist media and journalists to just demonize Damore. I saw it even among my own colleagues, even among psychology professors. They would say, "Oh, isn't it terrible, that Damore memo? And I'm so glad Google fired him." And I would challenge them on it and say, like, "Did you read the memo?"
Yeah,
And
what
most
was
of them,
terrible?
most of them hadn't. Most of them hadn't. And the ones who had and still didn't like it, I would challenge them and say, "Have you read the literature on sex differences and preferences? Do you actually know this area?" And they don't. So the bad thing here is it's easy to find psychology professors who will say Damore is wrong, but who don't actually know the literature, because most psych professors don't.
That's really interesting, actually. I didn't know that. I would have thought that he wouldn't have met much pushback from your colleagues, basically. Do you think that it's out of a sense of, I don't want to say fear, but I can't think of a better way of putting it, that there's such almost willful ignorance of what he's written there? Or do you think it's just genuine... Again, I can't think of words that don't sound pejorative when I say this, but out of genuine ignorance, say.
I think it's actually just bog standard ideological tribalism, of the sort that Jonathan Haidt did such a good job of analyzing in his book, The Righteous Mind. I think when my lefty psychology professor friends react to the Damore memo in a way that is ideological rather than scientific, they just are, they're not really reacting as scientists. They're reacting as people who are really frustrated that, Hillary Clinton didn't get elected last year.
Yeah.
People who are frustrated that in their own lives there were instances of sexism, right, if they were female faculty.
Sure.
And they're bringing that to the table. And that's okay, but all of us have, I think, a professional duty as scientists to question our own biases and to ask, am I really reacting to this as a partisan, as a citizen, as an activist, or as a scientist?
Well, you say that, but the critical theorists have done their utmost best to undermine the concept of objectivity, haven't they? So
Yeah.
the general prevailing narrative from the extreme left at this point is that there's no point trying to check your own biases, as I understand it.
Yeah, that is the prevailing view. That the frustrating thing is psychology, unusually among the kind of social and behavioral sciences, has a real passion for objectivity, and we really try to get things right. And we are very well trained in statistics and experimental methods. We are very critical of each other's studies and ideas. It's really a well-functioning science most of the time in most domains. We kind of weed out the grad students who can't do the science, who can't think dispassionately. But when it comes to sex differences, people seem to kind of set that aside still. And I don't know, I guess they think the stakes are so high in modern America or modern Britain that they kind of can't afford to stop being activists some of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I think I can only assume that's what they think, because it pervades everything they do. I mean, one of the most amusing things, and I say this in a very cynical manner, is the idea of transgender men being able to compete in women's sports. And this is something we see. Ronda Rousey, a famous female MMA fighter, ferocious apparently. She's commented on this by saying she fought a male to female transsexual, and she was just astonished at the power behind the blows she was receiving from this person. And I mean, and you got someone like Venus Williams, who, when they say, "Oh, you're the number one female tennis player in the world," how would you be comparing to the men? And she's like, "I'd be like 500th or something like this." And it's reality. It's just staring them straight in the face, and yet they don't want to hear this from top female athletes. They want to parade these women around as exemplars of feminism. Look at this woman's achievement, and when this woman is just demonstrably showing them the gender differences, they find it really difficult to deal with.
Yeah, this blows my mind that the thinking here is so short term that they celebrate these little symbolic victories, but they don't ask, where is this going in 5 or 10 years? If you don't believe in biological sex differences, the only logical endpoint is that we don't differentiate sports competitions by sex. That it's just a truly level integrated playing field. It's men and women competing together. And what's going to happen then? It's going to be the most male-dominated outcome you could possibly imagine in many sports. And then what? Then do you say that's bias against women, but women won't even exist anymore as a category? Right. If you reject the gender binary, you can't have male versus female wrestling or MMA or American style football, or you can't have anything.
You're absolutely right. It's the feminists are going to have to. I mean, they're going to find themselves, even if we do keep this category separate and have male and female sports. If transgenderism is sort of promoted and increased, and eventually you have a much larger segment, say like 2 or 3% of the population that become transgender, eventually you're going to find men who have transitioned into women dominating female sports in general. And I think you're going to get a segment of feminists who will eventually say, well, we need women's only, a turf version of the sport, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, the nightmare scenario, which I hope doesn't happen, is in MMA, for example. Like, I've done a little bit of MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I know how physical it is and how much strength and skill is required. Imagine you had a lot of, men transitioning into being women and doing MMA. There will be serious injuries. There will be deaths. There will be trans women literally beating female competitors to death in MMA fights. I mean, they won't intentionally do it, but that's what'll happen.
It'll be the nature of the beast, yeah.
That's a totally predictable outcome of this.
Yes.
And then what's the feminist response going to be to that?
Well,
to say, oh, well, it's okay to sacrifice a few women on the altar of overcoming the gender binary?
Yeah.
Or are they going to go, oh, that was a bit of a mistake?
Well, I've had enough feminists say to me at this point that women's individual choices don't matter. It's the liberation of women as a class that matters. And I think this kind of the sort of Marxist lens infuses modern intersectional feminism to the extent where I think that they will literally say that's okay. But I mean, that's going to create a chilling effect for other women who actually want to go into the field. If the field is dominated by transgender men, and these transgender men are regularly breaking the eye sockets or, the cheekbones or whatnot of female competitors, then they're going to look at that and do a basic cost-benefit analysis and say, I'd rather not. And that's going to make the field even more male-dominated. And it becomes a self-fulfilling, sort of a self-reinforcing mechanism then, doesn't it? We need even more feminism because of what feminism has done to these sports.
Yeah, I think the hardcore intersectional feminists would say it's okay for a few women to be beaten to death by trans women.
Absolutely.
In MMA. And I kind of understand the utilitarian calculus that if they really believe patriarchy still exists in America, then overcoming it for hundreds of millions of women and future generations, it does make sense to say you got to break a few eggs. I can understand that reasoning. The problem is the public relations, the optics, are going to look really bad. And I think in general, social justice activists don't understand public relations very well.
No.
And they don't understand how to get mainstream liberals or centrists or sympathetic moderate conservatives on their side. They're very good at signaling to each other.
Yes, definitely.
But not to anybody else.
And I think it's very interesting how you say that if in the ideal world they would ideally erase all of these gender barriers, and is exactly as you say. I mean, it would absolutely be an entirely male-dominated sport in almost every category. I mean, I can't think of a category in which men wouldn't physically dominate over women in a sporting venue. So eventually you're going to have feminists arguing for the gender binary, aren't you? I mean, I don't see any other outcome.
Yeah, I think they're going to have to rediscover the gender binary with regard to physical traits, which almost all, even the staunchest gender feminists up until a few years ago believed at least evolution works up to the neck, at least it shaped
Yeah.
bodies, but they seem to have even forgotten.
I can tell you why. Actually, I've read my fair amount of feminist literature, and there is a common belief among feminist academics that the physical differences between men and women are due to socialization, if you can believe it. Apparently, boys are encouraged to do more physical activity than girls, and exercise, and etc., etc. Doesn't really explain men like myself, who were pretty adverse to physical activity when we were growing up. Why am I physically stronger than my wife, for example? I'm not really one for long distance running or something, but I think they've honestly persuaded themselves that it's entirely socially constructed.
Yeah, which is hilarious because the physical differences between boys and girls before puberty are pretty minimal. It's really the hormonal surge at puberty that makes the growth curves separate from men and women. That makes male grip strength twice as much as female grip strength. That produces male upper body muscles. I don't know how you have a latent socialization that kind of like gets drilled into the boys' heads and just sits there and has no effect. And then suddenly, lo and behold, it just happens to create a growth spurt at the same time that the hormones just happen to kick in and mating effort just happens to develop. An amazing coincidence, really.
Well, I mean, like you say, I mean, why should it not manifest itself prior to puberty? If boys from, say, the age of 5 are socialized to go out and do sports where girls are, I don't know, knitting or whatever it is the feminists think they're doing, why would you not see it manifesting then? But like you say, it's relatively, there's no particular difference until puberty. And I mean, it seems to be really well scientifically established as to the reason for the physiological difference between men and women, and then down to like muscle density, bone density, and these things can be accounted for, well, like you say, through hormones and various other things. I mean, is there not a point that we can just call them science deniers?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, they're science deniers. They don't.
Okay.
They're not trained to think scientifically. They don't publish scientific experiments. They don't read science. I doubt that most gender feminists subscribe even to like New Scientist magazine or Scientific American. They don't like scientists as people.
They don't like the results of the science.
They don't hang out with them. They don't like the results. They and yet they think they're qualified to comment on science or to reject it.
It's very interesting, isn't it? It's very. I mean, I don't know anything about the climate change debate, but this is the sort of thing I will hear from people involved in the climate change debate, where they'll say, "Oh, those right-wingers haven't read any of the papers. They don't know. There's a huge consensus among scientists, therefore." And many of the time, these people will be feminists or very left-leaning. And it just strikes me as a deep irony that they have their own sacred cow that they have to deny a whole field of science in order to try and justify. And they'll complain about right-wingers doing exactly the same thing when it comes to a different field of science.
Yeah, it's very compartmentalized and it's very hypocritical. And yeah, exactly. The left is happy to embrace science when it seems strategically useful to them. But even then, they don't really embrace science. For example, on climate change, they'll embrace the evidence for, man-made climate change, but they won't embrace any possibility of geoengineering to reduce global warming in cheap and effective ways that don't require handicapping global economic growth. They hate that. They hate geoengineering because it means they can't use global warming as a whip to flagellate themselves about their sort of, guilt over being in a capitalist society.
So it's very interesting to say that, because I read a book called The Wrong Way Home by Dr. Arthur Diekman, who was a Californian psychologist. And he was involved in the anti-war movement in the 70s, the nuclear disarmament movement. And he was saying it was very interesting how the sort of very far-left activists were absolutely convinced that nothing could be done, that this was total disarmament or nothing was the answer. And he looked into it independently, and he found that actually if we would stockpile food and make bunkers and things like this, millions of lives would be saved in the event of a nuclear war, and therefore it was advantageous to do that. But the sort of hard left activists then denounced him. I can't remember the labels they used, but it was effectively calling him a misogynist. It was something, I can't remember the label, but it was, they would denounce him as an enemy of the movement or something like that. And it's very interesting how we see the same pattern of, and he was a psychologist and he studied cults, and he found it to be a cult-like behavior. And it's very interesting how we see exactly the same sort of behaviours replicated with the far left now, especially when it comes to gender ideology.
Yeah, I think it also means, what this also reveals is that there's a big mismatch between what the leftists say they want to accomplish versus what they actually want to accomplish. Because if you give a really good, cheap, effective, let's say libertarian solution to some problem that they're really worried about, they typically will reject it even more strongly than somebody who rejects that the problem is a problem. Why? Because the problem that they claim to want to solve isn't really their agenda, right?
Their agenda is control, isn't it?
Their agenda is often control. Their agenda is often very tribal. Their agenda on the left is basically smash patriarchy, smash capitalism, smash, whatever they think the underlying evils are.
Yeah, they. Sorry, I'm just getting a bit of a frog in my throat.
Sure.
And this is something that I found very interesting, because I'm very well read on military history and power tactics. This is just my personal interest. I've always found it fascinating. And one of the things that first alerted me to the dangers of intersectionalism was the fact that none of it could be separated from power. And that to me is a very scary thing, because as soon as someone is telling you that everything they believe has to be contextualized within the realm of power, then that what they're talking about, regardless of the subject, is in fact power politics, because that's the only way to affect the change they want to see. They can't just persuade someone of the correctness of their views. They have to control them, regardless of whether the views are correct or not. In fact, the correctness of the views becomes irrelevant at that point. What matters is making people believe. And this seems to be reflected in Diekman's work, and it seems to be something that we see all the time. And it's interesting how you've mentioned along the way, this is a strategy, this is a tactic. And as someone who likes his military history, I can't help but see it that way. I mean, is this something you're familiar with, or is it just something that you accidentally said?
Yeah, I think it is really all about power, because the left at the moment sees, ideology as a tool of power and power as a tool of ideology, and they can't really separate the two. And so what we see on campuses, for example, is the left thinks, oh, we can actually intimidate administrators into adopting, let's say, certain speech codes that say, it's unacceptable to have certain views or to say certain things.
Yeah.
And they think that just because they've convinced a few local campus administrators to agree to exert a little bit of pressure on, faculty and other students, they think that's a major win, almost in terms of military strategy. And when I talk to them about, okay, what's your next step? Are you going to convince, like, Americans in general, smash patriarchy, smash capitalism, smash the gender binary? What's the pushback going to be if you just play that out as power politics? And so, like, they understand administrative power, but they don't understand military power. So when I point out to young people, what do you assume you're right? Assume that there is systematic oppression that is racist and sexist and capitalist, and that it's supported by both the full might and power of the U.S. military and the opinions of local and state law enforcement, and by many, let's say, Trump supporters in red states. You're going to fight them with pure power politics? Like, with what? There are 320 million guns in America, and most of them are not owned by leftists. So, like, what's your end game here? If you want a partisan civil war, it is obvious who would win that.
Yes.
And it's not going to be intersectional gender feminism that wins it. And I'm not making a threat. I'm just making an observation.
No,
that
you're absolutely correct. It's
like,
laughable.
Once you enter the domain of power, you're in the domain of power, and you better face how power actually works. But of course, these folks don't read military history, so they don't understand what they're actually up against.
And I genuinely think they do view it in terms like this, and because they always talk about things as if they're territories to be conquered, and I find that really interesting. For example, like the reason I came to all of this is because I was a nerd. I played my video games. I liked entertaining myself in this way, and all of a sudden, there was, I can only really describe it as a feminist incursion into video gaming, where the feminists had been very insidious, and they're complete institutionalists as well. They will happily find any structure of power, regardless of how inane it is and irrelevant really sometimes, and they will work to put people in positions of power in these structures, and then they will use their power to attack anyone who disagrees with their ideology. And it's amazing to me how wherever they go, they find enemies. They'll go into, they'll go into like female-friendly spaces and find misogynists, and it's just amazing. And this was really exemplified to me when I went to MythCon. I was invited to have a debate at MythCon. I don't know whether you're aware, but and instead of contesting it, because they had tried to get me deplatformed. There was a systematic campaign of harassment against the organisers of MythCon in order to deplatform me, but the organisers of MythCon knew that this was going to happen, and that's honestly one of the reasons I think they'd invited me, because they wanted me to at least be present. And as soon as the cabal of feminists who couldn't get me deplatformed realised this, they suddenly started trying to get other people not to go, and they encouraged their own fans and activists, don't attend, as if this was territory that had been lost and had to be ceded to the misogynists or something. It was so strange, because I'm just thinking, if it was a conference I went to and a feminist was invited to speak, I wouldn't tell people not to go. It would be, I guess I would be looking at it through the lens of military tactics and thinking, well, now I have to have a presence there in order to, show that there is opposition to what they're doing. But instead, they'd completely ceded the grounds and were surprised when people who were on my side turned up and dominated the audience. Oh, sorry, you've muted or something. I know.
The big irony here is that the same people who deny the relevance of evolutionary psychology to modern human life and to like it's irrelevant that we lived in prehistoric tribal societies for hundreds of thousands of years are acting out exactly the tribal instincts that we study in evolutionary psychology and that are completely well understood by, biological anthropologists and students of history in general. Their behavior is so predictable from evolutionary principles, and they don't even know it. And that lack of self-awareness, I think, is actually handicapping them quite a bit because their strategies are so transparent now to everybody.
Yeah. And I think it would probably do us better if we didn't try and encourage them to improve, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah. So don't read anything about anthropology, biology, psychology, or military history,
or Sun
please.
Tzu, or
Yeah.
Machiavelli, or anything,
Yeah.
anything that might end up helping you. But we've gone for over an hour, so I guess we should probably call to a close. But it's amazing how we start talking about the biological differences between the sexes and end up talking about Sun Tzu. It's really but what I find worst about it is they're using people's own good intentions against them. That's what I find so insidious and unconscionable about all of this. It's like, well, you want to help women, don't you? You want to help minorities, don't you? And everyone and their mother's going to say, well, of course, I don't want women to be oppressed. I don't want my minorities to be oppressed. And so they use this use people's own good intentions as the weapon against them. And so when it comes to someone like me who can, I think I can see what they're doing. I can just say, well, no, I'm not gonna allow you to use my own good intentions. I mean, at MythCon particularly, it was really embarrassing watching the reaction from the feminist I was talking to. It was I don't know. It was like he was like he didn't know what to do. He didn't have any other angles of attack, and I found that very interesting. But
yeah, the terrible thing here is the left demands that everybody virtue signal in the same way that they like to virtue signal. And if you don't, they will accuse you of being, cold-hearted, psychopathic, racist, sexist, transphobic, Islamophobic, whatever.
Yeah.
And then if you make a genuine revelation about, here are the things I've done in my actual life that have been anti-sexist, anti-racist, etc., and those are credible signals of my true values and beliefs, they will dismiss all of those.
Oh, yes.
Right? And they'll say, no, those are irrelevant. That's just window dressing. You have to adopt our version of virtue signaling, our policy recommendations, or else you should be ostracized by society. And I think that demand that everybody should channel, their empathy in the same ways that they do, it's just extremely counterproductive. I'm a libertarian, and I think often the best way to handle social problems is extremely counterintuitive, and it's not obvious, and it takes a while, and it depends on market-based solutions and freedom, and it doesn't make for a very good virtue signal in the short term, but in the long term, I think it's often more effective. All of that whole approach is anathema to the current left.
Well, it's completely totalitarian, what you've just described there. Everyone has to do things the way we say, even if it's just something as asinine as virtue signaling. I mean, the idea that they feel they are entitled to demand that everyone do what they say, or else they're a bad person, or whatever, the punishment may be. It's really revealing about the people who would say that. Because I can't imagine ever saying to someone, right, everyone has to do things my way or no way at all.
Yeah, and they also put so much emphasis on language.
Oh, yeah.
And they think that changing language can change the world, and that policing the way people talk is going to police their actual attitudes, and that if we just speak about issues in the right way, the issues will magically resolve themselves. And I think that is symptomatic of people who spend way too long reading the wrong things, way too long indoors, people who don't have any any experience people who don't talk to people who don't agree with them.
Hmm.
And language is wonderful, and I spend most of my days reading and writing and lecturing and so forth. But it is not the solution to major social problems.
Right. Okay. It's very interesting because I'm working on kind of I guess a thesis on the nature of the bourgeoisie themselves, and this is definitely something that I'm seeing as part of the bourgeoisie because I mean, as you say, like whether your actual actions and the actual reality of what you've done is irrelevant to these people, and that's completely true. That's and this is why the harm that they do is completely irrelevant as well. I mean, I've seen male feminists berating women because they're not feminist, and it's if you take that out of, just look at it as a out of context as a stranger, right? You've got a man berating a woman. That's an anti-feminist thing to do, surely, and yet these male feminists will feel completely entitled to do that because of the ideological conviction they hold. And it's like, okay, but the reality of what you're doing is irrelevant here, isn't it? It's legitimately, it's honestly scary to me. If it goes down that road, I think that the it's very similar to some of the terrible things we saw happen in the 20th century. The ideology mattered more than the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I hope this is sort of a high water mark for this kind of insanity, and that it'll sort of go away a bit in the coming years. But I don't know. It could just turn into an endless runaway, Maoist cultural revolution. It could actually destroy civilization.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but like one of the things that worries me is the institutional power these people wield. I don't think that I find. I mean, like for example, why did James Damore have to be fired? This is the thing that I just can't get over. He was an engineer who wrote a 12-page memo saying maybe we could get more women into Google if we just acknowledge the gender differences between men and women. And I mean, I just, in a normal company, in a normal environment, nothing should have happened to James. Like I if I was running a company, I'd be like, okay, thanks for that, James. Go back to your desk and carry on doing whatever engineering work you do. And that would have been the end of it. And then when I'm going through these proposals, I'd have been like, right, no, I don't agree with that one. Even if I was like the most ideological feminist, I'm like, no, I don't agree with that. Yes, I agree with that one. And it would have meant nothing. But I can't help but feel there must have been some kind of repressive atmosphere within Google for this to have been said and to have warranted the response it got. 'Cause I mean, like Sundar Pichai had to come back from his holiday in Africa. He had to cancel his holiday and come back and re-establish the orthodoxy at Google through a conference call that was eventually cancelled because of threats or something. And Susan Wojcicki, the CEO of YouTube, wrote in Fortune how there were no biological differences between men and women. So she had to publicly out herself as a science denier in order to like maintain the narrative at Google or something. I find it's so weird, but it's obviously oppressive, and there's obviously something toxic going on there. And I think that's just them expressing their power to maintain this kind of ideological hegemony. But I mean, I can't prove it. But
Yeah, I think it's kind of hilarious. You got Sundar Pichai, cutting short a holiday in Africa where the sex differences literally evolved to fly back to, Mountain View to say there are no biological sex differences, and we will intimidate and fire anybody who says so. And I think Google's an amazing company. It's one of the most powerful institutions in the world now. Mm-hmm. It's probably more powerful than most governments.
Sure.
If it, lives up to its motto, "Don't be evil," it could be a huge force of good. But it seems to have been hijacked by social activists and their ideologies, and it is going to deter so much talent from joining them. And it's already deterred people from using their products. And they really need to get this right soon, or they're going to lose a lot of brand equity and a lot of competitive advantage.
It's interesting. They actually repealed the "Don't be evil" motto.
Yeah,
They actually
yeah.
repealed that a few years ago and replaced it with "Do good" or something like "Be good," and
Hmm.
that really bothered me on a deep level, because there's a big difference between
Yeah,
"Don't be evil" and "Be good," because it's just, I mean, not being evil is something that almost anyone of any ideology can probably look at an event and say, I don't need to know the further context. If you've, say, persecuted someone or tortured someone or something like that, that's an obviously evil act. But being good is a matter of opinion, and it really depends on the ideology you hold there. And then, it's a rabbit hole to go down. But yeah.
yeah, it sure is.
But anyway, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I hope people really enjoy it.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's
Yeah,
been great.
absolutely.
Thank you, Carl.
And where can people find you on Twitter or wherever?
So I'm Primal Polly on Twitter, and my personal website is primalpoly.com. Or if you just Google my name, Geoffrey Miller, Geoffrey with a G, things will come up.
Great. Thanks so much.